In my videos I mentioned several times that António Costa, just like José Sócrates and many other socialists, has never done anything in his life. He is a career politician without any experience in anything other than jumping from political position to political position as he licked the boots of the right person inside the Socialist Party. And to continue exposing the lies of António Costa in the recent debates and also in his campaign, there's nothing better than to start by exposing the career of António Costa. When he was 12, he decided he wanted to be a socialist. At 14 years of age, he joined the Socialist Youth. He graduated in law in Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Lisboa. He was made part of the Lawyers' Order in 1988 after being a trainee in the office of Jorge Sampaio, another socialist. He supported Jorge Sampaio when he wanted to be the leader of the Socialist Party back in 1992. In 1996, he was the campaign director of Jorge Sampaio's presidential run. In 1995, he was the Secretary of State of Parliamentary Affairs in António Guterres' government. And between 1997 and 1999, he was Minister of Parliamentary Affairs. In the second government of António Guterres, he was Minister of Justice. In 2004, he supported José Sócrates when Sócrates wanted to be the leader of the Socialist Party. Between 2005 and 2007, he was the Minister of Internal Affairs of the first government of José Sócrates. In 2005, he was also the Vice President of the European Parliament after being part of the Socialist Party list for the European elections. Between 2007 and 2015, he was the Mayor of Lisbon. In 2014, he became the leader of the Socialist Party and ran for Prime Minister in 2015. He lost the elections but made deals with the far left to throw out the democratically elected government in 2015. He ran for Prime Minister again in 2019 and won those elections. He is running again for Prime Minister in 2022. As you can see, the career of António Costa is basically climbing the ranks within the Socialist Party by getting himself close to those inside the Socialist Party that would help him rise the ranks, like Jorge Sampaio. Furthermore, we know that as a child, António Costa wanted to be a socialist, showing the void he is in terms of experience in anything of note, because socialism is an ideology, is not a profession. There are indeed politicians that have something to show, that did quite a good job in whatever government they were in or in any public job they got. But António Costa is the opposite and has absolutely nothing good to show in his political career. In fact, when he was in government and when he was the mayor of Lisbon, António Costa was an absolute disaster. As mayor of Lisbon, António Costa was responsible for making the life of everyone that wanted to go to Lisbon miserable, after the work done in Avenida da Liberdade and the roundabout of Marquês do Pombal. António Costa was also responsible for more taxes as he created the airport tax for tourists in order to cover the many financial holes of Lisbon's City Hall. António Costa also tried to prevent Benfica, one of the big football clubs in Portugal, of paying taxes, because António Costa is a fan of Benfica. And of course the floods in Lisbon that were a constant while António Costa was the mayor of Lisbon, and showed the chaos that Lisbon had become when he was in office. And we even have an example of how switching from one socialist to another doesn't fix anything, because when António Costa left the mayor position, Fernando Medina, another socialist, became mayor of Lisbon, and the floods continued to be a big problem. The socialists, and António Costa in particular, are a disaster to whatever they put their hands on, because socialism can only prosper with corruption, nepotism, helping friends and family and party members, and where competency for a certain job is not relevant. The last 2.5 decades in Portugal are the perfect example of this. Having said all this, let's get back to the lies of António Costa during his recent debates and also the lies in his political campaign. When debating André Ventura, António Costa blamed Ventura for the cuts in pensions a few years ago because Ventura was part of the Social Democratic Party at the time.
Sr. Deputado, ainda outro dia, no debate com o Dr. Rui Rio, confrontou o Dr. Rui Rio com o corte das pensões.
Exatamente.
Mas convém lembrar que o PS, que não era só o Dr. Rui Rio, fazia parte do PSD que cortou as pensões. O Sr. Deputado também era militante do PSD que cortou as pensões.
António Costa also claims this during his political campaign, saying that the cuts were made by the Social Democratic Party. But what António Costa never mentions is that those cuts were negotiated and signed by the socialist government of José Sócrates, of which António Costa was part of. Actually, this is one of the big lies from the socialists since 2011, because they spread the narrative that only during the Troika financial adjustment program were pensions cut and there were tax raises. But this is false. The cuts started with the Growth and Stability Programs, better known as PECs, from the socialist government of José Sócrates, specifically between 2010 and 2011, when Portugal was already bankrupt, thanks to the disastrous leftist policies applied by the socialists, including António Costa, since he was the Minister of Internal Affairs of the first government of Sócrates. There were 4 PECs in total. 3 were approved, the 4th one was rejected in Parliament. In all of the PECs that were approved, cuts to the public expense and tax raises were present, and PEC 3 was the most severe. So let's analyze PEC 3 in some detail so that we can better understand the lie from António Costa and the socialists that always forget to mention that the cuts of wages, pensions and tax increases started with them. In terms of cuts to the public expense, the socialists had this in PEC 3. Reduce wages above 1,500 euros in the public sector. Pensions are now frozen. Promotions and progressions in the public sector are frozen. New admissions to the public sector are frozen. Reduce number of public servants with contracts. Reduce the expenses of the national health system. Reduce expenses with the public sector health insurance. Reduce 20% of expenses with the social wage subsidy, which is better known as RSI. In terms of tax increases, the socialists had in PEC 3 recheck collectible deductibles from the IRS, rechecked fiscal benefits for companies, increase VAT to 23%, increase the public sector pension contribution by 1%, among other cuts and tax increases that you can check yourselves in the links in the description. So with PEC 3, the socialist government of José Sócrates, of which António Costa was part of, started some of the biggest expense cuts and tax increases that Portugal has ever seen. The 23% VAT that currently exists in Portugal was the result of the socialist PEC 3 from José Sócrates' government that increased that tax from 21 to 23%. The freezing of pensions, the public sector wage cuts, the increase of the contribution for pensions in the public sector, the cuts in the national health system, etc. This was all part of PEC 3 from the socialist government of José Sócrates, of which António Costa was part of. Obviously, the socialists and António Costa never talk about this, since they play with the very weak memories of the general population and spread their fake narrative that PSD and CDS were the only ones responsible for cutting pensions and increasing taxes. Which is obviously false, because not only did the cuts start with the socialist government, but the deal with Troika itself was made between the socialist government and Troika. The socialists agreed with everything in that deal, including expense cuts and tax increases, and signed the deal that they would need to follow if they had won the elections in 2011. In fact, the Socialist Party was responsible for Portugal's third bankruptcy in 2011. The Socialists requested international financial aid. The Socialists negotiated and signed the deal with Troika, including expense cuts and tax increases, in order to receive the loan between 2011 and 2014. But then the Socialists claimed that PSD and CDS are the only ones responsible for the cuts, trying to exclude themselves from the responsibilities they have in the bankruptcy of Portugal and also in the deal with the international institutions that led to those cuts. But this is what the socialists are. They cause the problems and then try to blame someone else for the consequences of the problems that the socialists created. António Costa personifies all this. But there's more. In the deal that the socialists made with Troika, there was a plan of privatizations that included, among other companies, TAP and the Portuguese Post Office. Both privatizations were made or started in Passos Coelho's government between 2011 and 2015. The privatization of the post office went well, but TAP was a company that was always in the red, and it wasn't easy to find a buyer for it. In fact, a buyer only appeared when the first government of Passos Coelho was at the end of its run. And after António Costa lost the elections in 2015 and made deals with the far left to throw out the second government of Passos Coelho that had been democratically elected a few weeks earlier, António Costa assumed the prime minister position and immediately stopped the privatization of TAP, making sure that the majority of TAP as a company was still owned by the Portuguese state. And as usual with socialists in power, as soon as António Costa reverted the privatization, he placed his personal friend Diogo Lacerda Machado in TAP's board. With the privatization reverted, TAP is now a black hole to the Portuguese taxpayer money, thanks to António Costa and all the left and far left in Portugal. Actually, during the pandemic, António Costa's government injected 1,200 million euros of the Portuguese taxpayer in TAP. And this was done at the same time that the socialist government provided almost no help to any other company in Portugal, as you can see in my video about the disastrous management of the pandemic by the socialists. In 2021, and with more 462 million euros of the Portuguese taxpayer injected into TAP, TAP is now almost 100% a public company. And this means that it will be an even bigger black hole for the taxpayer money, thanks to António Costa and all the left and far left in Portugal. But there's more. As soon as António Costa threw out the democratically elected government in 2015, after making deals with the far left, António Costa and his government made a budget proposal for 2016 to Brussels. But that proposal was rejected because it did not meet the deficit limits that were imposed by Brussels. António Costa and his finances minister, Mário Centeno, were forced to follow those deficit limits and change their budget proposal, but not in a clear way. The socialists resorted to what we call budget captivations. Budget captivation is a term used for a value that was part of the budget but was captivated and thus not spent. For example, if you have 10 million euros for the national health system in the budget for a certain year and the government captivates 6 million euros, that means that in effect only 4 million euros were made available for the national health system. This is a mechanism used to mask the budget numbers and give the idea that more is going to be invested in certain areas when in fact only part of that money will actually be spent in those areas. The socialists are always talking about the investments they made in national health system, in education, etc., but they never talk about the captivations they made because that would show that the actual investment was much lower or non-existent when compared to what the socialists claim. In fact, the socialists and the far left that supported the socialist government were spreading the narrative that they would bring the end of austerity, and nothing could be further from the truth. In the first government of António Costa between 2015 and 2019, some of the biggest cuts in public expenses were made, and the captivations were actually the biggest ever in Portugal's history. Almost 3 years ago, I made a video about the claimed end of austerity of the socialists, and even though I included many examples of that lie, it was still just the tip of the iceberg of the cuts and captivations the socialists actually did, that literally destroyed many public services. The cuts and captivations made by António Costa's government in areas like the national health system and public transportation, for example, were so big that trains stopped working almost completely. I used trains to go to work in Lisbon every day for 2 decades, but in 2017 there were less trains, those that actually showed up never followed schedules, and the maintenance of the trains was little to non-existent. And thanks to all this, on many occasions I was forced to leave the train I was on because it malfunctioned in the middle of the trip. In the summer, that can be quite hot in Portugal, the air conditioning units in each of the carriages of the train were more often broken than actually working. This meant that temperatures would rise to 50 degrees inside the carriages, making it impossible to breathe, especially when the train was full. And being full is what happened every day, every hour, because as I mentioned, the trains were less and did not follow the schedules, and so people had to be crammed inside the train just like you expect in a third world country. Before the cuts and captivations of the first government of António Costa, I took about 45 minutes to get to work. With António Costa's cuts and captivations, it took me between 1.5 hours to more than 2 hours to do the same trip. In the national health system, the cuts and captivations were so many and so large that when the pandemic hit Portugal in March of 2020, Portugal did not have the minimum of medical equipment to fight the consequences of the pandemic. And these problems already existed before the pandemic, since due to the lack of investment in health, there were many people in Portugal that had to wait years just to get a consultation or a surgery. And during the pandemic, the people that suffered from problems with other diseases and had to wait years for a consultation or surgery were completely ignored. And that's why Portugal registered thousands of deaths more in 2020 when compared to other years from problems not related with the new virus. All of this thanks to the cuts and captivations of the first government of António Costa. And it's never enough to remind everyone that those cuts and captivations were supported by the far left, specifically the Left Bloc and the Communist Party. These parties would often criticize the socialist budgets, but in the end would approve them without issues, showing how cynical and hypocritical they are, because what matters to them is to have their far-left agenda approved with the help of the socialists in exchange for approving the socialist budgets, regardless of what they contain. But there's more. In the video I made about António Costa's disastrous and criminal policies that contributed to the death of more than 120 people in the fires of 2017, I focused almost entirely on the political side of those policies. But I also mentioned the moral and ethical side, since the socialists and António Costa made some really disgusting comments that show that they are not really humans. They are beings without empathy, without emotions, without the ability to understand the suffering of others. António Costa in particular went as far as saying that 2017 had been a tasty year, when in actual fact it was the most deadly with fires in the history of Portugal. But before making that disgusting comment, António Costa had already shown the disgusting being he is. Just a couple of weeks after at least 64 people died in the fire of Pedrógão Grande in June of 2017, and more areas in the country were still burning, António Costa decided to go on vacations, leaving the Minister of External Affairs in charge of the government. But António Costa did not go on vacations without assembling a focus group to determine if the fires and the deaths in Pedrógão Grande had any impact on his popularity and on the popularity of the socialist government. At least 64 people died, thanks in large part to the criminal policies of António Costa and the socialists themselves. Hundreds of people lost their loved ones and their houses, their lives completely destroyed, but António Costa went on vacation and is more concerned with his popularity and the popularity of his government. António Costa is despicable, a true villain that we usually only see in movies, but António Costa is unfortunately very real. As I said in previous videos, if I continued exposing the lies, the disastrous and criminal policies of the socialists and António Costa himself, this video would not end. But I believe that with what I identified here and in other videos is enough to show the scum that are the socialists, the Portuguese left, and António Costa. António Costa, the left and the far left are a malignant cancer that infects Portugal. A cancer that, if not removed as soon as possible, will kill the patient, which in this case is Portugal and the Portuguese people. António Costa and the socialists represent the worst of the human species, beings motivated only by ideology, and their interests start and end in their own belly buttons. And the results are clear. Decades of socialism turned Portugal into one of the poorest countries in Europe, one of the most corrupt, one of the most indebted, one of the most dependent. The parasite culture and dependence on the state that are the consequence of decades of leftist policies in Portugal are already so strong that if nothing is done to change them now, Portugal does not have a future, and will continue in this vicious cycle of jumping from one bankruptcy to the next with a smile on our faces and elected the people that will bankrupt us again. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The elections on the 30th of January are perhaps the most important of our lifetime, because the socialists and the far left want to get their hands on the money that Portugal will be receiving from the European Union in order to distribute it to all their friends, family and party members. And if they win these elections again, that's exactly what they'll do. Little to no money will be spent for the benefit of Portugal and the Portuguese people. Portugal is bankrupt again and will lose the possibility to improve with the money currently being sent by the European Union. We will also lose the ability to request external aid in the next bankruptcy because the thousands of millions currently being received are already being appropriated by the socialists as we speak. Do not vote for the socialists, do not vote for the left and far left, or any party that supports this regime. And to be clear, do not vote for PS, PSD, BE, PCP, CDS, PAN and LIVRE. Voting for any of these parties means that everything stays the same, because all of them already helped the socialists in the past in one way or another. The only goal for these parties is to get power. The prosperity of Portugal and the Portuguese people is irrelevant to these parties. The only party that has proposals for change is the Chega party. Chega is the only party that wants the end of this corrupt regime, that does not want any change, because that's how it can continue to steal money from the Portuguese people without consequences, as is the case of the last 47 years. We need change, and we need to give power to those that want that change and make proposals for that effect. And this is not a comment only directed at those that always vote for the same people. It's especially directed at those that do not even vote and essentially give all the decision power to the fanatics that always vote for the same people. Do not let this happen again. You will not lose much time just to go out and make a cross on a piece of paper. Vote, and do not let the fanatical minority decide your future and the future of your children. That was the logic of many in the past, and after decades of record numbers of abstention, look where we are now. Portugal is one of the poorest and most miserable countries in Europe, and it's getting worse. Vote, and vote for change. I hope you like this, and I'll see you next time.